Welcome to today's video, guys. Today I'm going to be explaining the exact equation that we use to rebuild our clients' identities and scale their business to 6 figures per month. Okay. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Sean. I specialize in scaling info and service-based offers to 6 figures per month through my identity architecture systems as well as paid advertising. Okay. So let's just jump right into it, right? What we need to understand is that in order for us to recalibrate our identity, we need to have clarity. Okay. Clarity is basically it's like the motherboard of our decision-making matrix. It's the foundation of our architecture, how we show up on a day-to-day, and how we operate for ourselves, right? So you are a reflection of your business, right? The reason why you need to restructure your identity and recalibrate your identity is because your business growth and how you show up for your business is a direct reflection of how you view yourself on a day-to-day, right? Your self-conception, your self-belief, who you believe you are deep in your heart, and who you've proved yourself to be, right? So in order to recalibrate that, we need to have clarity, okay? So clarity is basically made up from two separate paradigms, okay? We have your conditioned paradigm, which is basically the learned beliefs, the defaults, the scripts that you've been fed, right, and taught. And we have the constructed paradigm, okay? Your constructed paradigm is intentionally designed, right? Choices, systems, the person that you know you can become and that you've designed, you're going to design yourself to become, okay? The only way that we can have clarity is if we understand the conditioned paradigm and the constructed paradigm, okay? Because that's the only way that we're going to have polarity of where we need to be in our existence and how we show up for ourselves, okay? The reason why you see people who maybe are successful or who have had, maybe some success in their life, but they don't operate as that 6 to 7 figure entrepreneur, for example, is because they don't have the identity and they don't feel deep in their heart that they actually are who they say they are, or they actually operate as the person that they know they can be. This is why, money doesn't buy character, right? That's where that quote comes from. It's because they're operating in a constructed paradigm with the belief system of a conditioned paradigm, okay? So polarity is the key, right? If you don't have polarity and there's no differentiation of the conditioned and constructed paradigms, then you're going to be in the middle. And if you're in the middle, there's no understanding of how you need to be differentiating your decision making. There's no clarity on how you need to be operating and breaking your decision-making matrix and how you should show up for yourself on a day-to-day, what decisions you need to be making, right? So the first step is to have clarity on these two principles, okay? Now, there's going to be both narratives and triggers that are correlated to each of these, okay? So the conditioned paradigm is going to have narratives and triggers, and the constructed paradigm is also going to have narratives and triggers, okay? So what is a narrative and trigger, okay? We need to understand about narratives and triggers is that a narrative is basically a perception and perspective of the world that is fed from old experiences and emotions that we've experienced up until this point, okay? So a lot of the times why people are still stuck in loops of who they are, their identity, is because they're living based off of, and they're viewing their life from an old narrative, okay? In order to get clear on who you need to become, you need to understand these narratives and what sparks these narratives through the triggers in order to isolate and make these narratives obsolete, okay? So the way that we do that is by being very intentional with our understanding of the triggers and the narratives. The trigger is basically the event that sparks the reaction, that basically triggers the narratives through emotions, through ideals and perspectives, which basically keeps you in an old narrative, okay? So a good example of this would be like locations, right? People, okay? Your perspective of, like, let's say you're doing something like something reminds you of your past that triggers an old narrative that then forces you into this loop where you're basically stuck in your suppressed reasoning because you're feeding off of an old narrative, okay? Conditioned paradigms and constructed paradigms are both going to have narratives and triggers. So what we need to understand is the first step, getting clear on the conditioned paradigms, the narratives and triggers that are also reinforcing these paradigms, okay? So that we can then design a constructed paradigm and then develop the narratives and triggers around the constructed paradigm to then have new triggers, to then have new narratives that we view our life through, okay? This is exactly how we do it, okay? The only way to move forward is by understanding the triggers that are forcing you to act from an old narrative, okay? Super, super important. So now that we have outlined the fundamentals of the conditioned and constructed paradigm as well as the narratives and triggers, we need to understand how the conditioned paradigm is actualized and how it is formed and how it is bolstered, okay? Because the conditioned paradigm is something that is developed over time, okay? It's not something that you just wake up with and one day you have this fucked up worldview. It is something that continues to develop over time and through conditioning specifically, okay? So what we need to understand is there are natural variables that are in today's society, in the world that we live, that develop this conditioned paradigm naturally. Okay, because what we need to understand is that the conditioned paradigm or the society is dependent on your agreement. Okay, your society is dependent on you coming into agreement with the conditioned paradigm in order to keep control. Okay, so first you need to isolate the variables that feed this sort of conditioning. Okay, so that's going to look like government, right? Education, society, ideologies, people, locations, media, culture, religion, family, right? These variables are going to feed conditioning. That is then going to feed pressure, which gets you to come into agreement. You understand? And the conditioning looks like judgment, right? Programming, submission, obedience, fear. Okay? That's not to say that these variables are always conscious of what it is that they're doing, are always conscious of the conditioning that they're providing, because some of these variables are going to be very intentional, and some of them are going to provide very unintentional conditioning. Okay, some of them are going to provide conscious conditioning, and some of them are going to be conditioning you unconsciously. Okay, and the whole point is that regardless of if it's intentional or unintentional, it's still happening. Despite the conditioning being unintentional from certain variables, it does not make the conditioning irrelevant. Okay? Because the conditioning is happening whether we like it or not. Okay? So the only way to counterattack the conditioning is through awareness. Because what happens is that this pressure is developed here through perceived consequences that urge conformity through this pressure. Okay? And what this does is that the conditioning, its number one job is to get you to come into agreement. Okay? Because coming into agreement is a very natural thing in order to get you to be on board with the perspective of how the variables want you to live and conduct yourself on a day-to-day basis in order to have control. Okay? So the way that they do this is by feeding you the loop of compliance. Okay? And the loop of compliance is made up of two things, right? Well, technically three things: compliance, conformity, and fear. Okay? The compliance and conformity feed the conditioned perspective. Okay? Because the conditioned perspective precedes the conditioned paradigm, right? Because you cannot have a conditioned paradigm without a conditioned perspective. First, the perspective needs to be conditioned. Then once the perspective is conditioned, it then feeds a survival state, which then reinforces fear and reinforces agreement. Okay? This is how the perspective becomes formulated, right? This is how the conditioned paradigm becomes formulated, right? And once it has gone through this loop of compliance multiple times, it'll go through fear, compliance, conformity, conditioned perspective, survival state, back to fear, back to agreement, okay? Back to compliance, conformity, conditioned perspective. Most people who are not achieving their dreams or attempting their highest potential is because they are feeding the loop of compliance unconsciously. Okay, so your first step is understanding that you need to become conscious of the conditioning that's happening. Okay, so the problem with this is that it creates dependence on the worldview and paradigm for survival and well-being. Okay, so once you become aware to this, you need to understand that this is how it's formulated. This is how the conditioned perspective is formulated. It is then put into a survival state, which is then bolstered through narratives and through triggers. Okay, the reason why this is so important to understand is because a lot of people stay in the loop of compliance without understanding how the bolstering process works. But the bolstering is where the narratives get developed, and then the triggers get developed around the loop of compliance, which then develops the limiting beliefs, which then develops the limiting perspective of life, which then keeps people in a loop of compliance, right? The narratives and triggers solidify the conditioned paradigm by bolstering and reinforcing the conditioned perspective through a state of fear and survival, okay? Which then feeds a developed conditioned paradigm, okay? So as you see, the conditioned paradigm is not just something that you wake up with, right? It's something that's developed over time, right? Through conditioning, okay? So now that we have a good understanding of the conditioned paradigm, we need to understand how to develop the constructed paradigm and how the constructed paradigm is formed and reinforced.